Explore the harmony of health and holiness through a Catholic lens. Discover how faith rooted in tradition fosters vibrant living. This podcast rebroadcasts the weekly Becoming Gift segment on Morning Offering on Ave Maria Radio. You can check out the Physically Spiritual podcast from Awakened Catholic for my long-form discussions and presentations, or you can find my Substack at becominggift.com. This is your host, Andrew Reinhardt. On a dark night kindled in love with yearnings, oh happy chance, I went forth without being observed, my house now being at rest. In darkness and secure, by the secret ladder disguised, oh happy chance. In darkness and in concealment, my house now being at rest. In the happy night, in secret, when none saw me, nor I beheld aught, without light or guide, save that which burned in my heart. That's not an O-antiphon.
No, right. Too long to be an O-antiphon.
Those are the stanzas of The Dark Night of the Soul.
Oh, my goodness.
By St. John of the Cross.
That sounds familiar.
Some of the most beautiful poetry ever written in the Spanish language, of course, although we have to hear it in its deprived translated state in English today. But this great contemplative writer and doctor of the church, St. John of the Cross, left us this idea of the dark night. And it's honestly one of the most commonly misunderstood concepts in all of the church's mystical theology. One reason is that John of the Cross meant multiple things by darkness in his writings. And another is that it's such a compelling category. People often glom onto it for, I think, literary and impactful reasons. But when John talked about the night, he talked about it in different ways. And this is what he says in his prose that describe his poetry. He says, we may say that there are three reasons for which this journey made by the soul in union with God is called night. The first has to do with the point from which the soul goes forth, for it has gradually to deprive itself of desire for all worldly things which it possessed, by denying them to itself, that which denial and deprivation are, as it were, night to the senses. Right? So the sort of deprivation, or what sometimes we call it asceticism or penance. So one reason that the spiritual life is a night is because part of the spiritual life is depriving our senses of that which they desire, and by that changing our desires to not desire for earthly things, but for the Lord. So this kind of active purgation, this active is sometimes called the active night of sense, where we're choosing at the beginning of our spiritual life, especially, to deprive ourselves of those things which are pleasurable and good, but in order to do penance, to break attachments and attach ourselves to God. The second reason here, he says, the second reason has to do with the mean, or the road along which the soul must travel to this union. That is faith, which is likewise as dark as night to the understanding. So there's something essential in faith that is a sort of darkness. And to understand John of the Cross, we have to understand that he would have been educated in a system that was heavy on St. Thomas Aquinas and the understanding of the human soul and of epistemology coming out of this the scholastic tradition. And part of this is the understanding that we have, as human beings, reason and will, but a lot of the life of our mind is our internal senses, meaning our imagination, our memory, our sort of basic judgments, and the knitting of our experiences together, and our basic sense experiences. And faith acts exactly contrary to our typical mode of understanding anything. Right? Typically, I experience something in the world with my senses, so my intellect starts with that image, that impression, those sensual experiences, and by recalling those or thinking about those, we then come to understand things. Well, faith is the exact opposite. Faith is a direct knowledge of our reason without sense impression. So what that means is I know that God exists, but can you imagine God? No, there's an image of God that really captures him. We can know God through analogy. We can know God through sacrament, but sacraments also hide God, or there's a certain darkness in the sacraments too. Or I can know God through the via negativa, right? I know God, what a God is not. So to some extent, faith is always somewhat dark because it doesn't come with that kind of sense impression. Okay, then he says, thirdly, it has to do with the point to which it travels, namely God, who equally is dark night to the soul in this life. So the idea that God doesn't have a body except in the person of Jesus Christ, of course. And, so that's why God can reveal himself in the sacraments. But God himself doesn't come with sense impression, right? So there's this way that faith, that our spiritual life, we're entering into a space of knowledge that's different than our ordinary way of knowing. It's a supernatural way of knowing. And in this journey, there's this continual darkness in the journey as a result of the nature of God and the nature of faith. So there are particular dark nights that John talks about, the passive night of sense and the passive night of the spirit. And these experiences are sometimes what's called contemplative aridity. And last time we talked about the discernment of spirits and that we can experience states of desolation as a result of our weakness or as a result of our attachments or whatever, but there's sort of this ebb and flow of the spiritual life through consolation and desolation. But desolation always has a cause, and at its root is a certain amount of purification. Right? But to understand the difference between desolation and contemplative aridity, we have to understand that there's two different reasons why your eyes might be blinded. One is that the room is actually dark.
Right.
The other is that you've entered into a space that's too bright. Right? And the brightness of the light at first blinds your eyes, and then there's a period of adjustment by which your eyes come to be capable of seeing in the new brightness. So contemplative aridity is the latter, that we've actually moved forward and there's a new brightness of our experience in the Lord that at first is blinding and disorienting. And it's a perseverance through that period by which we then come to be able to experience the Lord again. So this is what he has to say. He says, this night, which as we say is contemplation, produces in spiritual persons two kinds of darkness or purgation, corresponding to the two parts of man's nature, namely the sensual and the spiritual. And thus one has night or purgation will be sensual, wherein the soul is purged according to sense, which is subdued to the spirit. And the other night is purgation, which is spiritual, wherein the soul is purged and stripped according to the spirit, and subdued and made ready for the union of love with God. So this purgation, this stripping, this real spiritual pain, the suffering, is a way of preparation so that we can be stripped away of everything we've mistaken for the Lord, all of our idols, all of our attachments, so which we can be actually connected to God in himself.
Yeah, and I have lots of thoughts and questions about this, but I want to come to one thing that I hear, I think, completely misinterpreted and explained in an incorrect way regarding St. Teresa of Calcutta and her own spiritual darkness, and they say this disconnection with God, and yet she served him anyway. Not true. I mean, it more goes to the way you're explaining this, right?
Exactly. And I would say even there's because the nights of sense and spirit are temporary periods you pass through, but Teresa had this persistent period of darkness at the end of her life. So some souls, you might call them sort of a victim soul,
right?
By which they pass into an even darker night through which there's a greater perfection that overflows into the whole world. So some mystics and some great saints pass through this persistent period of darkness and trial and end of their life. So I think Teresa was experiencing an even darker night. Thank you for listening to Becoming Gift. You can catch the show live every Wednesday at 8 a.m. Eastern on Ave Maria Radio. You can also find my long-form podcasts, discussions, and presentations on the Physically Spiritual podcast. Subscribe to my Substack at becominggift.com to find more from me, and don't forget to like and subscribe.